Breaking news, Nikon has released Firmware 2.1 for the famous Z9, and it might solve all of the problems that we have. We go live now to our correspondent in the field, already testing the camera. Chelsea, are you there?
Hi Tony, I'm here at Harkness State Park with the Nikon Z9 to report on the new firmware update.
Wait, cut the satellite feed. This just in. You're using a Gmail email address. You're using social media for your professional web presence. You're sending customers to Facebook or Instagram covered with ads for your competitors. You need your own domain. Get started today at squarespace.com/Tony. Set up a website all your own. Drag in your pictures, your videos, tell the world a little bit about yourself, accept appointments from clients, create a logo, build an entire brand. Start today, squarespace.com/Tony. Get a free trial, and when you love it, use the coupon code TONY to get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. I've run many websites on their platform for many years, and I've been completely pleased with it. Now, back on location with Chelsea and her Z9.
We have the Nikon Z9 here, and we're going to be testing it without the new firmware update and with the new firmware update to see if it actually solved the autofocus problems we saw in portraits and wildlife photography. I'm going to be using my model, another Tony, here cloned for continuity reasons, to test the portraits. You could see without the firmware update, it was sometimes drawing a box around his entire face, and this time it was mostly drawing a box over his eyes. I'm going to redo that because a bug just tried to attack me. You could see in the first examples without the firmware update, it was often drawing the autofocus box around his entire face or his chin or the wrong place. This seemed to draw the box over his eye most of the time, but we'll have to look at it close up to see if it actually got in focus.
I'm told the satellite is beaming the results directly to my computer here. On the left, Firmware 2.0, on the right, 2.1, Enhance. We're looking for a sharp iris and blurry eyebrows. If it properly focuses on the iris, then the eyelashes and eyebrows will be slightly out of focus. Before, with Firmware 2.0, you can see the eyelashes are sharp, but the iris is slightly out of focus and the eyebrows are quite in focus. With version 2.1, yeah, it seems like it more accurately focused on the eye. Ooh. But the Z9 always did okay shooting head on. Where it really struggled was in 3/4 and profile. So let's look at those examples. At 3/4, they seem about the same, and this is looking at more than a dozen different examples, just trying to summarize it here. Let's check them in profile. In profile, we can see it's improved, but not completely solved. With Firmware 2.0, it focused on the side of my head, completely ignoring the eye. And with Firmware 2.1, it did seem like it got a little bit closer to the eye, though the iris is still solidly out of focus. Is the Nikon eyelash autofocus problem solved? Well, not solved, but it does seem like it's improved. You can now get sharper portrait results for those of us shooting really high resolution, shallow depth of field images where you'll most see that. Now, a lot of you will say, who really needs that much detail on a face? That's too much. Well, you don't need it all the time, but the reason you might spend $5,500 on a camera and $2,500 on a lens is because you do want to be able to get the sharpest possible results. Indeed, there is something magical when you nail focus on a person's iris. Not only does it give the appearance of an overall sharp image, since the viewer always immediately looks at the eyes in a portrait, but it casts the pores that's on the nose and the forehead a little bit out of focus, giving them a little bit of natural blur. That makes them more attractive while still conveying overall high levels of sharpness in the image. I've been wondering why Nikon in particular struggles with this, and the answer might be the number of autofocus points. It has 493 compared to the Sony A1's 759, compared to almost 6,000 autofocus points on the Canon R5, which has amazing dual pixel autofocus. This means that the Nikon will find the eye and it draws a box around it, but the autofocus point might not be right on the iris. It has to jump to the closest autofocus point, which might be over the person's eyelashes. Indeed, even on tight headshots like that, the eye only consumes 1/2000th to 1/5000th of a frame, so thus you might need more than 2,000 autofocus points to really be able to nail autofocus on the eye, unless you switch to a secondary algorithm like contrast-based autofocus. Now let's go back to a reporter in the field to test wildlife autofocus.
Now I'm using the Nikon 600 f4 to test the autofocus for wildlife to see if it's improved. A lot of people have asked why we're using this f-mount lens, and it's because we can't get our hands on the z-mount lenses for the 400 or 600 millimeter or 800 millimeter. They're just not available right now. This is fully supported by Nikon. This setup is good. Stop it.
The Z9's 2.1 firmware update specifically addresses a scenario where moving animals are small in the frame. This is far away flying birds. One of the questions we got after our wildlife review of the Z9 was, why would you want to take pictures of a bird that's so far away? It's not going to produce a good result anyway. If you're not a wildlife photographer, you might not understand this. But when we capture a flying bird big in the frame, it didn't start out that way. You start tracking a bird when it is far away and small in the frame, and you hope that the bird flies towards you. Let's look at an actual sequence of my wildlife photos. First, this is my actual Squarespace website, and you can see this first picture is a bald eagle with a fish filling the frame, right? Let's look at the sequence that came to make this picture. Here's the first picture in the sequence, and you can see the eagle is very small in the frame here. In fact, I'd been tracking it flying for several seconds before I first pressed the shutter. As luck would have it, the eagle continued to fly towards me, and you could see I was eventually able to fill the frame with the bird. If you look at the sequence of the bird approaching, you can see I couldn't always keep the bird centered in the frame. With a 600mm lens, you have tunnel vision. You're looking through the tiniest little angle of view. Also, it's really big and heavy and the animal is fast moving. It's very hard to simply keep it in your viewfinder. You would never be able to first acquire it when it was that close to you, not with any sort of accuracy or reliability. That's why you start tracking something when it's far away and continue to track it as it gets close to you. That's why that is such an important trait for a wildlife camera. Before we show the results from the Nikon Z9, I want to bring up a common point that people had about wide area AF. Many people said in Chelsea's review of the wildlife capabilities of the Z9 that she used the wrong settings. They said she was getting a bad experience because of user error. In the screencast that she showed, she was using 3D tracking. They suggested she should be using wide area AF or auto area AF instead. The fact is, Chelsea and I both spent extensive time with the Z9 experimenting with all of the different autofocus point settings in many different scenarios. We found wide and auto area AF frequently locked onto subjects that were not the bird. They rely on the subject recognition of the camera, and if the camera does not recognize the subject, especially against a complex background, it will latch onto something else, often completely casting your subject out of focus so that you cannot even find it in the viewfinder anymore, completely ruining all your chances of getting the shot. Thus, we decided to rely entirely on 3D focusing. We will always use the settings that we think produce the best results. And if you don't believe me, go through my Instagram. You can see for many months I've been sharing pictures taken with the Z9 and saying positive things about the Z9, and I've been able to produce good results. But good results are not enough when you're spending this much on a camera and lens, because consumers have choices, and that's what we do here. We compare the gear to other options, and in our experience, we found we got better results with the Canon R5 or Sony A1 than the Nikon Z9. Before we draw any big conclusions, let's take a look at how the 3D tracking has changed in Firmware 2.1. First, a little montage of 3D tracking before using Firmware 2.0.
The Z9 with Firmware 2.0 failed to track flying birds more often than either the Canon or the Sony. The Nikon often failed to find a bird in the frame, even when I used 3D tracking and put the AF point right on the bird. Watch as this goal seems to disappear. The Z9's focusing hunted until the bird was lost in the depth of field, and no one ever saw that bird again. And that bird had a family.
Here are the results we got after installing Firmware 2.1. You can see it does succeed at tracking birds in many situations, especially when the bird is closer to the frame. This crow isn't the easiest subject, but the eye is clearly visible and the Nikon does occasionally see it, but also chooses to lock onto the back of the bird frequently. But then it did a great job tracking it flying directly at the camera, very challenging. Here in the tree, the Nikon did find the subject correctly, but the autofocus system locked onto the branch in the background. I finally got it to lock onto the foreground by recomposing and pressing the AF on button repeatedly. As with Firmware 2.0, it did a good job of finding well-lit subjects like this rabbit. Big in the frame, it locked right onto the eye, and indeed these pictures turned out very sharp. Watch as the Z9 switches from 3D tracking to eye autofocus once it detects the subject. This bird it stayed locked onto, very good. With the well-lit bird against a clear sky, it switched from 3D tracking to subject detection and continued to track it until the bird got a little too small in the frame, and then it wandered off, tracking absolutely nothing, just a blue sky. Very confusing. And yet in this example, the bird is smaller in the frame, but it does a great job of tracking it until it suddenly loses track of it. This is the unpredictability that I find frustrating. I almost would rather have something like a D850, which isn't as intelligent, but I found to be more consistent, so at least I know what to expect from the camera. In each of these examples, Chelsea was standing next to me shooting the Sony A1, which had no problems tracking these same subjects. 3D tracking, wide area AF, any different setting we chose, we had the same subject tracking problems. The Nikon could not stay locked on. It wandered off and caused us to miss the shot. Now, despite us putting more than 6 months of intensive testing, taking more than 35,000 pictures with the Nikon Z9, doing our best in every different situation to get the best possible results and getting a lot of good results, we have a lot of people who want to dismiss all of that work by declaring it bias. This seems straight up ironic to me, to dismiss an objective reviewer who has never accepted money or free gear or sponsorships from any camera or lens manufacturer. One of the few outlets who can actually say that, to dismiss all the months and months of hard work that we've done to give you objective information to help you make buying decisions, and providing no evidence except to declare bias. In fact, that seems ironic because it actually seems a little bit biased, right? Thank you, Nikon, for continuing to improve the Z9, and I promise as long as you do, we will continue to update our reviews because we want your users to know about the advantages. We want buyers to choose the best possible technology, and we want competition in the industry. We want there to be 3 solid players, Canon, Nikon, and Sony, each trying to outdo each other, because that is what is best for photography, for consumers, for me, and for you. In the comments down below, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this firmware update and everything else. And thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace, which makes beautiful websites incredibly easy. Right now, head to squarespace.com/Tony. You can start building your website. No credit card required, just a free trial. Put your pictures in, talk a little bit about yourself, bring videos in, set up a portfolio, make a website for your business, and you know what, get a custom domain. So you're not Gmail or AOL or Yahoo.com anymore. That is not pro. A custom domain is professional, and you can get started at squarespace.com/Tony. After your free trial, when you love it, the coupon code Tony gets you 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. Bye.